Welcome to Skeptic Minds podcast, episode number 4, second edition, because the first one got deleted.
Yes, it blew up apparently.
Yeah, my computer just popped and deleted a bunch of files on my computer. So
And like the editing was almost done, and
Yeah.
it took forever to edit.
It-
But like,
it took me a lot longer to edit that one than it should have, and if I had taken care of it in time, it probably wouldn't have been an issue.
I mean, oh well, we're gonna have
What
to
can you
record
do?
another one eventually. But like, I thought we had some good content in there. But oh
Mhm.
well, I'm sure we'll.
Yeah, and it was probably a good podcast too. It just I don't think that was like anything special of a podcast. I don't think that we were like missing too much.
No, it was the best one we've ever done by
Oh,
far.
yeah,
like
true.
no one's ever gonna be able to hear the best content we'll ever produce. Nothing will ever compare. But,
Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's what
What
that's
can
what
you
you're
do?
gonna say.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So this time, we're thinking about talking about authenticity and how that like fits into.
So real quick, these are your hosts, Colton Winters and Brock Epperson.
Let's go.
Yeah. And oh yeah, I want to disclose real quick, in case I sound nasally, I've been sick for the past week. That's also another reason we haven't been, like, why we didn't re-record it up until this point is because I was just nonstop coughing, and like I sounded super nasally, and so it's kind of still an issue, but it's definitely not as bad as it used to be. So
Yeah, that's significantly better. Yeah. So today we're talking about existentialism and authenticity, which I feel like we've had a lot of conversations about it, even though a lot of our conversations in the past haven't explicitly been about it. Like, in terms of like labeling and identifying with labels, like both you and I are pretty against conforming to labels or even identifying too much with these labels. And I think that's part of our idea towards authenticity, even though it may not have been.
I feel like we've had discussions about authenticity, like in the form of a true self versus false self, and like
Yeah.
I remember like playing that one like lo-fi song that had the anime bits to it. It was
Oh
like,
yeah.
Who am I? Like, oh yeah, relating it to phenomenology and like all of that.
True.
But yeah.
Yeah.
So we have discussed that a bit, but it's definitely not been as prevalent as like the label discussion or anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think authenticity really is like I think a very important thing to at least acknowledge. I don't think that going forward, like philosophically, anybody has to like focus on authenticity, but I think it's philosophically important and psychologically.
But what do you mean? Like there's not more that we need to like philosophically discover or like theorize as a whole, or are you saying as for the individual, on the individual level you don't need to go further?
I think it's similar to like talking about food. Of like, we can talk about food like a lot, but once you like understand what food is, like then you can start talking about steak or specific dishes that you want to make. Like, we don't need to talk about like the concept of food constantly.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
I think
pretty
it is
easy.
such like a, I don't know, but it's such like a reoccurring thought for me, or like a reoccurring, I don't know, concept that I guess kind of worried about is just the idea of remaining my true self versus false self and like that whole thing. And I guess not as much anymore. It's not really actually something I consciously think about all too often.
Yeah.
There are certain situations for sure where I'm like, oh, I was totally being fake, and I'm like, why did they act that way? Or I don't know, with some certain coworkers or like certain interactions at work, I'm like super fake and just this like, oh hey, you're so bubbly, so friendly, oh, and like afterwards I'm like, oh, what did I just do? Like, yeah, but I don't know. For the most part, I like don't stress about it too much, but it definitely used to be something that was just constantly on my mind, and like up until I was able to reach a point of consolement, it was like a huge stressor on me.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people even have the perspective, I'd say an incorrect or at least a harmful perspective of, like, if I'm constantly doing things that I don't want to do or in situations I don't want to be in, I can't be authentic, which I think is a harmful, reductive framing of the situation, where I think you can be fully authentic in situations that you don't want to be in. You can be yourself in a situation you don't want to be in.
Yeah, and I think definitely situations you don't want to be in are like quintessential parts of life and growing the self and developing one's character. So
yeah, if you only know who you are in situations in which you want to be in, do you really know who you are?
I like that from like the way you phrase that a lot, because that totally puts into light like that brings, at least into my mind, the whole concept of like anyone could have been a Nazi, in the sense that like until you're in the situation, until you've been indoctrinated or born into this German society in which everyone was like a Nazi and that was just normalized. How could you say that you wouldn't be that? Or and like until the person you love more than anyone else is murdered or your child's kidnapped, like until then, how could you say you'll never be a murderer? You'll never kill someone. Like you can only say so much until you're really in that situation. But once you've experienced that situation, you're like, oh yeah, I am capable of being that person, of assuming that complex and like having that personality. And so because of that fact, I need to be wary of it and ensure when those moments do arise, the complex doesn't take over me. And like that's another thing that I guess that I feel like discussed a lot, is the idea of not allowing inferior complexes to arise and trying to align with your higher complexes or your higher personalities.
Yeah, and for people who aren't wary of it, what are complexes?
So at least my understanding of complexes is it kind of originates from Carl Jung, and so what it is essentially everyone has many different complexes or personalities, quote unquote, and they're going to change completely depending on a variety of things, like whether it's the situation you're in. For example, if you're a doctor, that might be a complex that you'd assume, as in you have to be, like in your head, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to act more professional, more serious, like
Doctorly.
Yeah, however, whatever your idea of a concept of a doctor is, that's a complex you're going to assume. Or if you're a parent, or if you're with friends, or if you're with your boss, like all these different situations incites a different complex, as well as with the people you're with, which kind of goes along with the environment, the situation, as well as the feelings you're feeling. So if you're tired, you're going to act a certain way. If you're hungry, if you're super, super happy, if you're super sad, like all these different emotions also almost entirely, not like typically very heavily dictate one's personality in any given moment.
So
which I guess is kind of like the idea of being stoic or meditation, is to not allow your emotions to entirely alter your personality, and to stay more consistent. But
right, so like when you're hungry versus when you're content and happy can have an effect on the complex that you have with your boss.
Yeah.
Or it might even change the complex. You might have a completely different complex under those.
In which you're making different decisions, acting a different way, like your thoughts are even different, or
and it's a super interesting concept to tie into authenticity, because like if that's like the model that we're adopting to like understand how people have personalities or complexes, it's really interesting to think about how we can be authentic when there's like all these different versions of ourselves at the same time.
True. Yeah.
They're just dependent on the situation.
Yeah, that is true. I never really thought about that. and honestly, so then I guess here's a good question. How do you be authentic then? What is even authentic? What is thine true self? If you have a million different complexes, how do you even know what quote unquote your true self is?
Yeah. Do we like, is the true complex dependent on whether we're alone? Like, do we have the same complex when we're alone all the time, or do we have different complexes? But like that, is it like a light spectrum where in this portion of this light spectrum when we're alone, all of the different complexes that we can have there are those our true like authentic selves? Or is that just a continuation of this array, or are all of these complexes our authentic self?
What do you think about this statement? There's no such thing as a true self, only false selves. Only false selves.
I kind of like that.
Might be true.
perhaps like a rejection of all selves outside of. It seems as though
Like,
this would be hinting at like um, the least amount of thought that goes into how you act in the world, and just pure action would be the authentic self. To me, that's what I'm getting from that.
what I more so meant by that is like your true self is like so varying and so different that like how could you ever say that there is a true self, but rather you're still able to recognize false selves, or when you're being fake, or when you're assuming personalities that don't really like, or complexes that don't align with how you truly feel or how you truly desire to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, maybe you can still identify false selves, but is there really a true self?
That's the question. That's the question that I think individually people need to figure out. Even if they can't figure it out, like it's worth taking a swing at.
Yeah, I guess I even if there isn't a single true self, I think that in the same line that there are kind of fake selves, there are at least more true selves in the sense of what you're pursuing, or what you're I guess desiring.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel as though it's pretty like, of course everyone's going to be influenced by society and by the people around them and what they desire, but I feel as though some people's desires are explicitly written or created by the people around them, by like exterior influences, despite that not being despite that not being what will truly allow them to achieve maximal happiness in life. Yeah. In their whether it be like the career they choose, the person they marry, the deciding to stay in a religion because of peer pressure, or like whatever all these other things are, like they're giving into a lesser desire, the desire to look good for certain people or for their parents to not like them, in exchange for giving up that greater desire of like what makes them truly happy.
Yeah, with identifying with themselves.
What do you mean?
Because perhaps this is the metric to use for.
Okay.
I was thinking that perhaps this would be the metric to use to measure whether this is our authentic self, which is, or could this be the correct metric to use, which is actions that you take that you can't identify with yourself. Are these the false selves? And our actions, or even thoughts perhaps, that we have, are those ones that we identify with, regardless of how intentional the thoughts or actions were in trying to be authentic with them. The ones that we identify with might be the authentic ones. Like if
I feel as though that's true, but I don't think it's explicitly true, because I feel as though people are still up into exterior influence to a degree where like they're being influenced to desire or like identify with a certain way of being or certain like identity
right.
that doesn't align with what would allow them to be happiest.
Yeah. Because the examples that I had in my head for this were, would you say that it's more authentically, you're being more authentic for yourself when you take an action that you identify with, whether that's engaging with your higher self and acting in a manner that you find to be in accordance with your higher self, versus like, let's say, like this is not the case, but let's say like you stole a car in the past. Like, would you look at that action of stealing a car and would you identify that with your
So I don't think you're always
self?
like conscious of what your authentic self is.
True.
And so like, because of that fact, I think that you may have been labeled by other people as like, oh, you're a shy guy, or oh, you're let's take shy for example. You're a shy person, and so because you have this identity, you may be taking actions or having actions that go along with that identity of being shy. So like not going out or just staying at home. And maybe what would truly make you happy is having more friends, being more sociable, and like going out more. but because you're now identifying with this label that other people have put upon you, it's not allowing you to be your authentic self and therefore happiest self.
Yeah, true. I think that can feed into even like the examples that I gave of whether it's criminality, like people might label you as like a I don't know, a scummy person, not you, but somebody in whoever might be like labeled in general by like their community, their friends, their family, or whatever as like a scummy person, and like in a way that can almost feed into like their some amount of influence on complexes that push them towards criminality, and then from there that person may be able to analyze their criminality even though they didn't have any idea of they didn't have any sort of intention or even acknowledgement of their authenticity when taking these actions. They can still look back and say, that's not the authentic me. Like, these were outside influences that the authentic me would not identify with.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting thing to look back at even your own actions and analyze it in that sort of manner. I feel like a lot of actions that I've taken in the past, which are definitely not as bad as criminality, but a lot of actions that I've taken in the past I've looked at and been like, that's not something that I authentically identify with.
It's interesting. Yeah, because I guess like I've looked at it with a different framework in that like that has just been my inferior selves arising, and I've allowed them to like essentially consume me or like take over in those moments to where I take actions that I'm not proud of, or like commit actions that I'm not proud of later. And so I don't know, that's but I do feel as though it's been my authentic self when making those decisions. It's just a lesser authentic self than I prefer. Yeah, because even now if I take like criminal actions or like do certain things, and perhaps that's just because I've gotten to a point, some level of individuation, but I feel as though any like action I take now, even if I'm not proud of it later, it would still be my authentic self, just an authentic version of myself that I'm not proud of, or I don't want to assume.
I see.
That kind of like made me think of this concept that I've thought about in the past, but I've been recently thinking about again, which was essentially you want to live entirely for the past, and all the future and the present are tools. The future, so that way you can see where you want to be and where you want to go. That's how you like to determine what your goal is. The present is only a tool, in that like that's when you can act. Like the present is the time to act, as in like, I don't know, you can only ever act in the present, right?
Yeah. And
so like you take action in the present to ensure that the past is a pleasurable one to reflect upon, because the past is the only thing that is permanent. The future is like not guaranteed. The present is forever fleeting. The past is the only thing that's guaranteed. And so it's like this philosophy of living in such a way that the past is like the most pleasurable to look back upon, in which you're like as proud as possible of each decision you've made, every action you've taken, basically as content with your past as possible.
Live for the future of looking back on the present as if it were the past.
I don't think so.
I feel like that's just like a reframing of what you just said. Living for the future or living in the present for the future in a way that makes you look at the present, which is the past, in that light. So you're living for the past, but very indirectly.
Okay, I think so, yes. Because the present instantly becomes the past.
Yeah.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. Yeah.
And I think that's a really helpful perspective. I do think that adding that extra step to people's perceptions of, I think a lot of people like heavily subscribe to the idea of like, yeah, live so you can live the best future. But I don't think that people put enough emphasis on giving yourself a past for your future.
Yeah. And also like exactly, yeah, a past that is establishing your future.
Yeah.
And also the past is so at least in my opinion so important for one's mental health. Like
Yeah.
what your past is such a heavy influence on what your current mental state is.
Yeah.
Regardless of how forgetful you are, or how much meditating you do, or how at peace / content / like come to terms with everything you are or have. It's still going to completely and entirely influence who you are up until this point as a person, right? And so because of that fact, I guess, like, yeah, I guess the past is even more important with that kind of framing. Like, it entirely influences who you are. And so if you want to ensure you're the best person as possible, living the happiest life possible in the future,
looking back on the past in a perspective that is the best possible, like, there's a lot that's important. Like, perspective might be one of the most important things in our lives.
I think perspective is everything.
Yeah, perspective is so important. And
I think it's the most important thing.
Yeah,
like it decides everything. Like everything, because it also decides your desires. I think your desires are predicated on your perspective, and desires influence everything.
Yeah, I'm on board with it. I haven't thought about it.
Perspective is all.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't focus on shifting their perspectives very much. I think I think
it's learning, and a lot of people do care to learn.
To a degree, I don't think people focus on like the contrasting and comparing of their current perspectives to their past perspectives, or checking in on their perspectives, so then in the future they can compare and contrast a past perspective.
True.
And I think that contrasting and comparing is very important to see, like, if you're moving in the right direction with your perspective.
Because I think, despite, even if like a lot, I think that, let's say a lot of people like to learn, even if that were true, do a lot of people like to self-reflect, and like how many people are really self-aware on what their perspectives are?
Right.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right on that.
I think it's very important for people to test their perspectives or morality or ethics. It's super important to be testing this, and in a manner in which you can, like, know where you stand on things, and then in the future reflect on where you stood in the past and be like, is this a better direction?
Yeah. One thing that's frustrated me, though, is since I'm aware of that, and I'm aware of like how important your perspectives are, I like desired so badly to have a different perspective, but I'm not able to obviously just will myself to have a different perspective.
Right.
And hence a different desire. And so like the only thing that really allows me to completely shift my perspective, or just like boom, now my perspective's different, is learning. And so, but I'm not always learning, and so like sometimes I do get stuck, and if I'm not learning for a while, then sometimes I'll get almost not stuck, but I just stagnate, I guess, like not in necessarily a negative way, because it's never for too long to where I'm like, oh shit, like I'm just like becoming too old-fashioned or stuck in my ways or anything, but it's definitely long enough to where I'm like, oh, I'm probably ignorant in certain areas to where I still need to develop myself. And
do you ever feel as though you have an issue of shifting your perspective when perhaps it's like a one-on-one conversation with a person versus like reading whatever books that you read? Because it seems as though when you read books, at least from what I've noticed, it seems like you internalize and not necessarily comprehend, but you definitely internalize the matter that you read from books. I think more so than matter that
that's
you
a
discuss.
Toxic trait of mine is I hate being like something. Okay, it was actually this quote I like thought of when I was driving the other day. I was like thinking a little toxic trait of mine. I was like, damn, this is a toxic trait. I hate being taught, but I love learning.
Yep.
Like,
yeah, and learning through a book, you don't really have a teacher. Like there's a teacher, but the teacher's
But,
not
like,
conscious of
I'm
your
not
learning.
thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche when I'm reading his content, or Jean-Paul
Yeah.
Sartre when I read his content. I'm just like, it's almost just the words itself. Like it's just
Yeah.
Yeah,
Books are
rather
really
than a
good at
person.
that, at removing like tone. They're good at removing like personhood from the speaker of the words. And from that, it's just like this is just like a PDF format that's, I don't know, FMLA, a certain way of writing, of like mapping the world in a way. And it's easier to see that than when you're in a conversation with somebody who has tone, might be trying to win an argument, who's
you may also just not respect because of
Yeah.
like you don't respect the decisions they've made in life, or like for certain actions, or like certain other perspectives they may have, even if this one perspective is a valuable one, or for
sure.
whatever various reasons, as well as I think the inherent, at least I believe it to be an inherent human trait of I believe that and I've heard it from like other sources, which is kind of like solidified my belief in this, which is I believe that like every human finds more joy and derives more pleasure from discovering something themselves than being shown something. That includes like a song or a book or a movie or like a joke or a meme, like so many a TikTok. I find it pretty universally true to where people enjoy things on a much higher level when they discover it themselves than when they're shown it.
True. Absolutely. One thing that's I've thought about quite a bit is my dad did that a lot, where when he was helping me with homework growing up, he would never be like, well, now you do this next. Like he would say, I don't know, if I like, for an example, let's say I was having trouble like adding 2 + 2 = 4. Like he would break it down in a super easy way, like well, that's the equal sign, so after that is where like the total sum of the 2 and the 2 go, so you just have to add the 2 and the 2. So what is 2 and 2? What is that sum? And he would put it in a way where he's not necessarily giving the answer, but he's like framing it in a way where it's like, oh, like this is the path. Like
you can still discover it for yourself though, and derive that joy from it.
Yeah, like I'm not discovering it fully myself, but like I feel as though I'm discovering it.
Yeah.
And that feeling of discovering it on your own is important, especially for people who have trouble learning from other people. Like I think when other people make others feel as though they're discovering this knowledge rather than just having it shoved down their throat, like it's a different experience.
Yeah, and I guess that's also, like, now I'm thinking back, always been the most like influential things is when I'm listening to a podcast and I have like a random idea based on something they said, rather than just explicitly what they're telling me. Like sometimes I'll be like, oh, that's cool, or that's interesting, but it's usually those like more like the thoughts I have on my own based upon what they're talking about, then I'm like, oh, that's so profound. Like,
or do you ever have it when you even feel as though you are predicting where the conversation is going, or the conclusions that are being made in something that you're listening to?
I've stopped trying to predict as much because that only drove me insane. I hated it, like, because I would just too much of my thoughts would be focused on trying to figure out where they're going, and instead of like rather being in it. And like I feel like most of my thoughts now are more so completely analyzing what they're saying, and like going off on all these different like branches of possible thoughts, and how other things I've learned before can tie into it, and all these different things, rather than trying to predict. And that includes like in conversation and stuff like that, because I used to do it way too much.
If you're overdoing predictions, that can be harm. For me, I feel like personally I underdo predictions. I tend not to predict things very much, but every once in a while it's really nice, just like listening to something and in my mind being like, oh, this part's coming next, and then it does, and it's like, oh, like I have a good understanding of this, and it's something that I've discovered in a way for myself, because this this content or this podcast, let's say, or whatever podcast you're listening to, is going in a certain direction, but it is discovery.
Boogly boogly. Ooh, were they predicting that? Listeners, are you guys predicting that? Ooh.
Got him.
I was thinking, like, I wonder if everyone's trying to predict what you're about to say. So I had to, like, throw that in there real quick. All right, but go ahead, sorry.
You're totally good. Yeah, I do think that it's really important for people, especially who tend to underpredict, to at least try to predict, or you don't have to try super hard, but think about the things that you're consuming media-wise and thinking about your understanding of it and mapping it out and being like, well, if this is the map, then I think this is just a formatting logic in your brain in a way that maps to conversation.
Yeah, I realize I do that with media. Like when I'm watching TV shows or movies or like stuff like that, I still do it quite often. But other than that, yeah. But yeah, I do enjoy that. Like predicting something. Except something I hate is like when I'm on social media and I see it, because it just pisses me off even more. I'm like, I know exactly where this joke is going, or like someone says a joke that I've heard a million times, and so like I can see the antecedents for that joke already arise, and so as soon as like once the antecedents are there, I'm like, oh, someone's gonna make this joke. They say the joke, I'm like, oh my god, like, it's not even funny at all, because like it's been said a million times by a million different peoples in this exact scenario, like it happens so often. I guess even in social situations, yeah. So I do notice that, like, that's something that annoys me a bit.
I feel like the other day when we drove past the Denny's, where we're like, or not Denny's, D's restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, oh wow, that's such an old sign, because it was rotating and it had neon on it, and I was like, that's really old D's. And you looked at me, and it is. I find it really funny. Like, you looked at me, because it's like, we know there's the joke there, D's nuts. And you said it, and it's just like, yeah, that's funny, because it's like, it's overdone. It's an ironic joke. Like, if people are doing it unironically, yeah, then at that point, it's probably like, oh god. But if it's done in that fashion, I find like old jokes being dug up for irony.
Do you like dad jokes?
I love dad jokes. Largely because of their irony. Yeah,
I love that. For me, I guess it just depends on the mood, but typically I'm not a fan of them.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a fan of the like, ha, or, oh yeah, good one, or like, jokes, you know, like.
Oh yeah.
Like, I guess pun jokes are like those a lot. Like, there was this one guy, I went on before my first, like, semester of college, went on this river trip with a bunch of other freshmen, and so there's this one guy on there. I think he was like the boat guide or something. He was like a sophomore, and so he would just nonstop make pun jokes the entire time. Like, for the entire week, it was just nonstop pun jokes, and then all the other like kids started getting on board with it, and they would like rate each other's puns, and I was just like,
puns are pretty bad.
Yeah, they're not for me. Like, you know, people can do their thing, but I'm really not a fan of puns unless it's like actually clever.
Yeah,
like, it's a good pun, but I'm not a fan of like the dad pun jokes. Like,
it's very rare to come across a new pun.
True.
I feel like a lot of them have been dug up, and we're gonna be old, and then like all like the new slang is going to be like formalized in a way, and then there's going to be a bunch of dad jokes about the slang that's been formalized. I think like that will be the next wave of puns, but for right now it seems like we're out. Like we bottomed out this barrel. There's nothing left in there.
Well, I mean, puns are always like, at least the puns I usually see are just puns that arise from natural occurrence or like naturally occurring situations, and people will make a pun based on that situation. Like, I don't know, I have a bottle right here. They make like, oh, I got, I don't know, some empty bottle, but dun, like, you know, and so like, but it's never, yeah, they're just never really usually clever. But yeah,
they really aren't that clever most of the time.
I guess that's like the what I found humor in is when I'm not predicting it, when I'm not expecting it, when I can't predict it, basically.
Shock humor.
Yeah, to a degree, but also absurdism.
Oh yeah.
Or just like, yeah, So like shock humor or mainly absurdism. I love absurdism because I just hate humor when I know where it's going. Like then I legit will never find it funny if I know where it's going, because then I just view it as Twitch chat, and I'm not gonna be an IRL Twitch chatter. Like that's how I view it, because like in the same sense, like when something happens, so Twitch, for anyone who doesn't know, is a it's like live or YouTube, but instead of the videos being pre-recorded, it's all live. And so you can like kind of watch someone play live video games, or that's mainly what it is. And so then there's a chat, and people will type like emotes or emojis, reacting to certain situations, and they'll mass do it. Like the Twitch chat will just all be like thousands or hundreds of people typing the exact same emoji.
Like a text message with 100 laughing faces, but then you're in a group chat with 20, 30 people all doing a text with hundreds of laugh faces.
Yeah, like just lol or PogChamp or KickW, and it's just like, and that's how I kind of view it. Like I don't want to be one of the sheep or the masses that's just like gonna make the exact same joke in the exact same situation. You know, like it's not funny, it's not clever, it's not unique. It's like I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like in a way, it's almost like a collectivist, like hive mind thought pattern.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people can pretty easily fall into that. And in certain circumstances, I wouldn't necessarily say it's bad, but
I wouldn't either. It's like the easiest way to
socialize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially at like a lower level, like especially in lower level social situations in which deeper conversation is not really appropriate.
Yeah.
So like lighthearted humor and all that is usually not unique, not clever, but it's enough like where you know it's going to be commonly accepted. You know it'll usually get laughs, so that at least a lighthearted laugh or a smile out of someone, and so you just like make it because, yeah.
Yeah. True. I think we should probably hit on existentialism a bit then.
Yeah, I'm done.
So, you've read quite a few existential philosophers.
That's essentially been all the philosophy I've read has been by existentialists, authors or philosophers, and it's not like been an intentional thing necessarily, in the sense that I haven't like gone out there and even looked up top existentialist philosophers, or you know best books in existentialism. It's more so my first like real introduction into philosophy was Friedrich Nietzsche, who happened to be existentialist, and then from there I guess it's always just been the titles of the books have always been more appealing to me, the existentialist books, because that's how when I first started reading philosophy, and even now to a degree, I go off like the title if it sounds appealing, because I had no clue who any of these people were, especially back then. Like I didn't know any names or anything like that, so I was like, I don't know what books to pick, so I'll just pick whatever titles sound cool. And so like, and they all just kind of turned out to be, even now though, like existentialism is a humanism. I just like the title because I was curious. I was like, how can existentialism be a humanism? But that started getting me into Jean Paul Sartre or Anti-Oedipus. I was like, ooh, you know, that's super interesting. Like I'd just been hearing about the Oedipus complex in my psychology class, and so I was like, what's Anti-Oedipus? I read the back of the book. It was about like schizophrenia and capitalism, and I was like, oh, this book sounds amazing. By two existentialists, you know. And so like all the titles that have interested in me, and even like the first philosophy book I ever really read, Human, All Too Human, like that's what drew me in. I was like, damn, he gets it.
The titles of these existentialist books are, I feel like, very drawing. They like hit at something very visceral. I think so much so that it makes it so, I mean, if you're interested in philosophy, you can't help but read it. If it feels as though humanity is being questioned, society is being questioned or blamed or whatever, I think it's really interesting. Like Human, All Too Human, I think is like a perfect example of this title, or of a title like this. It really hits home, and then you think about it, and it's like, what is this book about?
Yeah. What does it mean to be too human? Like, I think I know what it means.
Yeah.
You know, like, makes you want to read more. See if he thinks what the human condition is the same as your concept of it.
Yeah.
Turns out it was pretty similar.
Yeah. Yeah, it boggles the mind how much these philosophers in the past had perspectives that are in a lot of ways congruent to or parallel to thoughts and patterns that we have today. And whether that's because they influenced like thought today, or if that's because like it's applicable to today, I think it's very rare to come across existentialists who aren't accurate. Like existentialists are very accurate, and I think it's been a huge help in analyzing society and ourselves, even, and like their contributions to philosophy and society are like, I think, invaluable in my opinion.
No. And I think, like, I don't know, it tackles, for me at least, the real meat of life, I guess. Like, why the fuck am I even here? You know, is there really that deeper meaning or deeper purpose? If so, like, what is it? You know, and what inherent morality, like, it tackles all these, like, kind of issues that, for me, were what was causing the most inner turmoil. And so, and now, I don't know, I guess that's kind of like why I've stayed drawn to it, is it helps console because you're granted new perspectives, which are ones that almost alleviate those negative thoughts, because they kind of they put a shift in your perspective on them, to where it doesn't have to be a negative thing that there's no meaning to life, you know? It doesn't have to be a negative thing that there's no inherent why or purpose for you being here, or like inherent morality. Like, these aren't inherently negative things, despite me previously having presupposed that it was, you know?
Yeah.
And so thank God for existentialism.
Yeah, I think it blew me away at first how many secular people, non-religious people, have a concept that there's like some sort of inherent meaning to the universe, or objective like morality or meaning. Like it blows my mind.
Do you include spiritual people into that, like, secular group in your mind? Because it's still like secular.
I mean, we could.
Yeah.
Like, even people who I would consider like very stringent atheists, I'm always surprised at how religious, quote unquote, they are with their belief in like an objective morality or objective meaning.
As in some atheists, like, they do have an objective meaning, or
they believe in one, that there is one, and that, like, with atheists, I would say that they tend to be more accurate, but in the same light, they're still having like a fundamental misguidance that even the religious do, of assuming that there is an inherent meaning.
Yeah. I mean, true, yeah, because it's just like a completely different thing to tackle, or not completely different, but it is a different thing to tackle than religion itself.
Yeah.
Religion almost just tries to answer the meaning, rather than like it being the whole question of what is meaning, or is there meaning.
Yeah. I think this is very much so much just like my perspective. I'm not trying to speak for you, but to me, I think to some degree existentialism is like inaccurate, although like earlier I said that I feel as though a lot of existential writers are very accurate with what they say, but I think they're accurate in a way that's like they're very clear on what they're describing. They're very clear on what they're trying to say and concepts as they propose. I think they're very accurate at creating and making those. But I think that their inaccuracy lies in whether or not there is like inherent meaning, which a lot of existentialists, I won't say that most of them even say there is an inherent meaning, but some do, and I think that's been in society, that's largely been what we've seen, is people taking up the assumption that there is inherent meaning, inherent morality. And I think, especially with like atheists, that should probably be one of like the first things that you question, like engaging with religion, is like, is there inherent meaning? Like, that will inform the almost, I think, the entirety of how you engage with religious people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how like the question of is there inherent meaning is so unimportant once you've overcome that question, in the sense that like it is important, because if there is inherent meaning, then that's everything. Like, then that's all life is, you know? And so then it's the most important thing. But because there's no, at least in my opinion, no inherent meaning, like, then it doesn't matter at all.
Yep.
And like, so then therefore it just matters whatever your subjective meaning is. And I think that it's quintessential to have a subjective meaning. And I think that's the stance of many existentialists.
Yeah.
Especially like someone like, what's his name? Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning. He just, he heavily preaches. He actually comes up with a whole form of therapy called logotherapy. And what that is essentially, it's psychotherapy, but it emphasizes how it basically prioritizes finding meaning in one's life and finding a form of meaning. It doesn't like matter really what it is. You just need some form of meaning to keep you going and keep you like caring and motivated, and having a reason to live and not just survive or not just kill yourself.
Yeah. Like phenomenologically, that like the experience of uncovering meaning or reflecting on your life and seeing like meaningful tasks or actions that you've taken in your past is incredibly important. I think like logically we can look at it and be like, well, if we just don't value that experience of reflecting on things and being like, wow, this is meaningful, if we don't value that experience, like very logically, like we can do that, but it doesn't seem to be a very helpful, useful idea. I've had an experience recently where like I was like, I had a loss of meaning in my life. Not to say that I didn't still want to do things, I didn't have desires or anything, because I definitely still had desires. Although I felt as though I was an observer who was observing these desires in my mind, and then the actions that I took based on those desires, and not having a sense of meaning.
Right, so you wouldn't interfere once observing the desire. You would also just allow your unconscious like mind or whatever to take those actions, and you just observe the actions as well, and your like observer mind wouldn't interfere and like be like, oh, I'm observing this desire, now I'm going to, since I have the almost power over it, I'm going to choose whether or not I want to act upon this desire.
Not quite, because I felt so the way that we typically think about the mind, at least from my understanding, is I think most people feel as though that they are the conscious self, and then they think about like the unconscious self as their self, but it's like the voice in the back of your head, or it's almost like a
true. That is how most people think about it.
Yeah, it's like a different mind almost.
But they're neither.
True, and I feel as though through this experience, I found a perspective outside of even my conscious mind of like a computer, like having a second partition that could observe this other partition, and within this observational portion of my mind, I was ineffectual on my conscious mind, and so I didn't feel as though it was my unconscious mind that was taking over, because I can still kind of like partition that out in my mind. I can see a difference between things that I consciously do versus unconsciously do, and I felt an understanding of my lack of ability to control my conscious mind as well as my conscious behaviors or actions.
But you still couldn't make choices with your observer mind?
Correct.
Because that is the ultimate goal of like most Eastern philosophy, is to become nothing but the observer, except whilst being the observer, while observing, you therefore, since you're observing, get to choose whether or not to act upon something. And so like you're the observer while still making choices on which thoughts you want to act upon. So it's interesting that you were able to become, like, achieve that observer status, but you weren't still able to, like, you know, choose which thoughts to act upon necessarily.
Yeah, like when somebody says, well, I'm thinking of like a specific red car or something, me saying that felt as though it's not the observer position that I'm looking at it from. When I say I'm looking at this, or I'm thinking of a specific red car, the voice that's saying this and the thought that's thinking that feels like a different partition of my mind than the observer that I was experiencing. And it was really trippy for a while. For a minute, it was really scary even.
Oh yeah, but where were you going with all that? Because like, weren't you like sharing that for a purpose? And I interjected.
I was. I don't know if I can recall.
You were in a scary spot for a bit. You were the ultimate observer. You had no meaning, loss of meaning, ultimate loss of meaning.
Right. Connecting this, back to existentialism. Like, I do think that we can logically think about how meaning, like, if we just devalue in our mind meaning, then we have ultimate freedom in a sense, air quote. Like, I just don't think that's the case from my experience. Like, I could observe things, but my observation felt as though it was as in tune with reality, being like I almost separated myself from myself, my conscious self, my observer self, separated from the conscious self, and could observe for the conscious self, like, in a way, like finding meaning in things, but this observer self understood that, like, that's an experience I'm having, and that's not even within my control. Like, I can't control the chemicals in my mind that's bringing forth, like, this experience of meaning, or derivative of pleasure, and this observer could only enjoy or have disdain, or it could only feel certain ways towards things that I said or did, or things that my conscious self experienced.
So it's almost a negative observer, to where you're just like, would you like, does it seem a proper analogy to where you're on a roller coaster, as in you're strapped in for the ride and it's taking you on a track, and you're not in control of where it's going, like the track's already kind of laid, you're just observing it,
sort of. Yeah, like, imagine if you put a camera behind your head and it's like a third person perspective of yourself on a roller coaster. Like, I felt as though I was observing myself on a roller coaster, and I understood that everything in life, like, is, like, determined, which is my perspective on things, is I believe things are determined. And so, like, I had
relate back to podcast number 3,
I think so,
for that
3 or 2,
yeah, titled Determinism and Free Will, something like that.
Yeah, and I think that that's played a big role in, perhaps this is like a new experiential thing. Like, I'm not so cocky to say, like, oh, I've discovered a new state of mind or being or whatever, but perhaps this is like a new experience of having, this sounds really cocky, but like true perspectives on the world and understanding, and then having this, like, higher understanding of the world changes your perspective in a way that you can't interact with the world in the way that people typically think we interact with the world.
mean, I can relate to that last part, I guess, or like at least my understanding of what you were saying a bit, in the sense that like once you have certain perspectives, it inhibits your ability to function about the world in such a way that like necessarily aligns with societal like norms or common values. Like I definitely feel as though my perspectives, especially in the past when I was much more nihilistic, had a tendency to make me much more not sociopathic is too harsh, but like in a way.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you meant?
Perhaps.
Quite a lot, like the second, like at least that last part, kind of last 2 sentences, 3 sentences.
I didn't feel like a psychopath.
Well, I don't mean psychopath. I just mean like less attached to my emotions, and like a lot of my perspectives, like, on, for instance, death, or on no one being evil, or like no person being bad, or like, like our, I don't know, society might deem them as like, oh, like they should they not be perspective based and they're just emotionally based. I feel as though that would hint at sociopathic tendencies, but because I'm feeling a lack of emotions, or like having a certain perspective, or so and so, because of philosophies I hold, then therefore it's not. But
perhaps,
as well as my perspective on kind of like what exactly love is.
Yeah.
In the sense that you don't actually love anyone, you just love the feelings they give you. People might label that, oh, it's sociopathic. But no, it's just a philosophy I hold, which may make it more difficult to like romanticize someone to the degree where I quote unquote truly am like infatuated with them and then just full on in love with them, because I'm just not willing to give in to all these bullshit, like, I don't know, fantasies, I guess.
Yeah. In a way, to reframe this experience or perspective, I would almost see it as we have 3 people, one person, like, and I think this is a archetype or a function some people have in the world that a lot of people understand, which is they go about the world in an unconscious manner. They don't consciously think about, I don't know, paying their bills. They don't consciously think about what they're doing in life and how to make their life better. Like, they coast. They don't think about things.
They wake up, they go to work, they like the routine.
Yeah.
Like creatures of habit.
Yeah, creatures of habit, and creatures of habit that almost very strictly stay within the confines of like the unconscious mind almost. And then from there, there's another level of people who...
I've definitely been there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who I think also sit in the conscious mind, that consciously think about things. And it felt as though that I went to like a third level of being the observer.
Yeah.
And understanding, in a way, like, we can live unconsciously, we can live consciously, and then we can also view things from just an observatory.
So yeah, you were like at that observer status, but you almost consciously chose not to, like, to detach yourself from your choices.
It wasn't.
Or do you view it as valuable that you were detached from your ability to choose, and you were simply observing?
I didn't find any like practical meaning or any practical good to come from it, or bad. It just was the case. Like, in a similar sense of, I feel like this tends not to be the case, but let's say you can live your life just as well and just as fulfillingly if you live that unconscious mind as your conscious mind. I don't think this is the case, but let's say it is. I felt as though that's how it felt going from the conscious mind to the observer.
I don't know what that means. What do you mean by that?
Like, it was just very neutral. It was a major shift, and like a connection in my brain between so many different ideas, but it wasn't so good or so bad that like I would say that it was like a non-preferable state from almost any position.
Cool.
Yeah, almost any way that I would look at it, I would say that it just was neutral, being in that state of mind.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because for me, I feel as though like once I attain that state of mind, like, but I also that state of mind isn't exactly the same as what yours was, but like once I achieve at least my desired observer psyche, I feel as though it'd definitely be an overall positive thing.
Why is that?
Like no questions asked, because of the fact that I've been able to finally separate myself from my more monkey brain, lizard brain desires and like influences and emotions and feelings to where I'm more able to think and make I guess more specifically make my choices solely with my observer, the real, like that self that is neither my conscious thought or my unconscious thought, but the thing that is like really quote unquote back there, like for anyone who like believes in such a thing, the soul, basically.
That's interesting. I don't know if there is necessarily that benefit from like being that observer perspective.
I think there is, in the sense that like then therefore your past, like kind of going back to what we were saying earlier, your past is entirely one you're happy with, because like once I achieve that status, every single one of my choices and therefore my actions are ones that I like internally, deeply internally, and want to ones I want to be making, and so then therefore my past will be entirely actions and decisions and choices I've made that I'm proud of and I'm completely content with.
Yeah, I do think that you can have a lot of contentness from that state of mind, but I don't know if it precludes you from like a detachment of the monkey brain to it, in a sense. Like I felt as though like I am like observing the mind of something that is inherently like has monkey brain.
Yeah,
and it didn't make me like, it didn't make my conscious mind more aware of this stuff or less aware. Like I got into this observer chair and it's like watching a movie mindlessly. It's
yeah, so I want, but like that's what I was saying, like I don't think our states are the same. Like what my observer state is different than your observer state. The observer state I'm trying to achieve, at least.
I see.
Because that observer state, I don't know, like I feel like I've been in a similar place, and it's not one I enjoyed. It's like much like too disassociated for my taste, and so I don't know, like yeah.
I really enjoyed it, I have to say. It was like, it was so like almost out of body in a way that like seeing or observing myself like taking an action, like doing chores or doing any sort of like physical labor, like I could observe and like feel like being tired or the desire not to want to do it, but like it was like, oh, I'm observing this, like this person I'm observing in the most true sense is they just feel tired, and are they going to get through it? Like we'll see. And like and like these value judgments in my mind seemed very, very clear. Like I felt as though I could almost see like myself make the value judgment, like, oh, this is too laborious, like I'm not going to do it anymore, or and it's like, oh well, like that's where my threshold is, that's really interesting. Or like whatever difficult task, whether it was like a mental task that I was doing, whether it was like really intense homework, like I could see myself thinking about things, and like personally, like once I hit a certain level of thought, like especially with homework and irrelevant homework in my opinion, there's a threshold that's crossed that it's like, okay, I have to take a break, or sometimes even I'm just done, like I'm not going to engage with this homework anymore.
Yeah.
And
I think that's that to me, like just it seems to describe just self-awareness, not necessarily like, yeah, that just seems to me what self-awareness is.
Yeah, perhaps it's just a shifting of, yeah, it really is like a shifting of perspective, because in one sense, like there's the self-reflection of like, oh, I do this thing and I know like, oh shoot, like I have a threshold here, but this observer state was like simply just viewing. It wasn't like, oh, like I have this state like, and it doesn't care about the consequences. Like this observer state is like, ooh, like you can see this threshold, you can see like, or I was able to see in my own conscious mind, like, oh, he's thinking about it in the future. Like, how is that going to affect him in the future? Like, is he like planning ahead of, oh, this homework is going to be like taxing mentally? Is he going to think about it in a way that, like sets him up for the future or whatever else?
And would those be conscious thoughts or like?
They are more so.
Like those thoughts that are like you don't have to actually think it all the way through because it's already understood.
It's just understood. It's like an implication in just the viewing of what's going on.
It's where you can have like 1,000 micro thoughts like in a second.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can also think a sentence fully through and like kind of think that way. But at the same time, you can just like think instantly without any time passing, really, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And in a way, it's like this observer state is purely like an experiential like state of mind. In a way, it's like similar to the like people who live in this unconscious mind, where they are just experiencing things. In a way, like getting to this observer state, it felt somewhat similar to being in that unconscious state, except for like more attention to detail on the experience rather than in the unconscious mind, or people who live in that unconscious mind. From my perspective, it seems as though like they're not like even trying to absorb, or it's not like built in to observe like this experiential life, regardless of how good or bad it is. Whereas with this observer state, it really felt like there was like no choice other than to purely experience like thoughts popping into my conscious mind and taking actions on those conscious thoughts, or even sometimes subconscious thoughts that would leak into the brain and influence decisions.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and through this, like, now that we're talking about authenticity as well, like it's just while talking through this podcast, it's making me think a little bit more of is that authenticity for me is at least like there's no way I could possibly say that experience could be the same for everybody, and that everybody should try to do that. Maybe that's like solely my brain's sort of thing that it can do, but I think perhaps that may be like the authentic self to achieve.
Yeah, I guess my like authentic self ideal is like a similar thing to that, like extremely similar, except I don't know, I guess just kind of framed differently. I don't know, maybe it's the exact same thing, but it's essentially just, yeah, it's like neither that like that conscious mind or like the, I don't know, there's just like a different part of my brain almost, or like a different a certain specific complex perhaps. And maybe that's what I am associating with my authentic self, but it's like I don't even know. Yeah, I guess just like a certain complex that, and perhaps it's just the complex that I'm choosing to identify with as my authentic self, but I recognize it as my authentic self, and I recognize it as my authentic self because it's one that is definitely not ever present. It's one that is not there all too often, except for the moments where I'm making choices that really align with my innermost desires or truest desires and stuff like that. They're most individual, or like it's the complex that has achieved the most individuation and like actualization and is as free as possible from influence from exterior things.
Interesting. Do you feel as though you fall into that mindset or framing of things in certain situations of this like Do you feel as though like that is? Do you feel as though you slip into this like observer state, or
Whenever I'm doing like I'm actually taking like whenever I'm like on my grind basically, or I don't know, taking things more like yeah, basically taking taking actions that align with my innermost desires.
actualizing the self?
Yes. And that's when I feel as though, yeah, that I'm in that state or achieving that state. And that's one that I find the most pleasurable when I reflect upon it. Like, that's the one I'm happiest when I'm reflecting on the past. I'm like, oh, when I'm in that state, that's the actions that I'm proudest of, I guess. And I always feel best about myself when I have assumed that complex for at least part of my day. Yeah. And so to get to a point in life where that is at least a more common complex would be extremely preferable in my opinion. And that's also one that I like, I don't know. Since I guess I recognize that as my higher self, it's just one I inherently desire to achieve. And I think that would also allow me to achieve, assuming that complex more consistently, would allow me to achieve my goals in life on a more consistent level and a quicker, more consistent pace, which would hopefully allow me to find more happiness, or the most amount of happiness, quote unquote.
In my mind, like that state almost seems like a part of the conscious mind, because I think I understand the state that you're speaking of. To me, like that would be like the conscious mind, like building like a framing up for itself and then fulfilling that framing.
I mean, it is kind of a part of the conscious mind, but it's a part of the conscious mind that can break through what is actually my conscious mind, what is currently my conscious mind. Like, it's deeper than my conscious mind, because my conscious mind can be, I don't know, consumed by some random media or like wanting to do random things. It's the thing that like breaks through my conscious mind, the thing that can like snap me out of it, or like assert dominance over my inferior complex, which is currently assuming my conscious mind, or like taking over my conscious mind. This complex I'm describing, or maybe that's not the right word, is like it like can break through, and like in moments where I'm assuming inferior complexes and therefore taking poor actions, quote unquote poor, it can like it's what will stop me essentially, or like be like, no, do this instead, or hey, we should do this, or as well as when I am taking those higher actions.
Interesting. Do you feel as though it's like such a different state from like the conscious mind as like?
Well, it's not even a state. It's just like a part of my psyche. Kinda. I mean, I guess it's a state because it's like, should it be an ever-present part of my psyche that is like constantly present, and those other inferior complexes or like desires are no longer present, then perhaps it's a state. And I guess it is kind of a state because I don't know, but I see it more as part of my psyche, or like a part of my a different part of my psyche than like the conscious brain or the unconscious.
Typically in my mind, the way that I think about like the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the observer are like three different shapes that to me, like unconscious and the conscious mind are like two parts of the mind that are very easy to understand and most people have. And then whether we're in the unconscious mind or the conscious mind, like there's like a temporal like grid that these shapes are traveling through, sort of like those old toys where if you fit a circle, or there's like a box with a bunch of cutouts on it, and there's like the cylinder that you can put through the circle, there's a giant cube that you can put through the square hole, and a triangle that you can put through the triangle. And in a way, like these different mindsets, I think, or these different states of mind, which have states within them or complexes within them, they are traveling through like a temporal field of shapes, similar to a circle going through, or a cylinder going through a circle hole. And the conscious mind is able to morph itself to see like the upcoming hole that it has to fit through, and can reshape itself into a different state, but it's still conscious. Whereas the unconscious mind seems to be moving through all of these holes, and some people get very lucky that they just so happen to be in a state or a shape of the unconscious mind that fits through the holes that tend to be the challenges in their life.
I feel like the goal would be so that way you're then kind of analogously, but even on another level, then you're now the observer, and the observer can as well do exactly what the conscious mind is doing to the unconscious mind, to where it's able to like shape the conscious mind to fit whatever hole it needs to. So it's able to like see, oh look, I'm about to be in this social situation, or go to work or whatever. I need to adopt this complex. I need to change it, my conscious mind, so that way I'm in the most adequate conscious mind for whatever situation. Or now I'm going to school. I need to like swap my conscious mind to be one of focus and one of determination and great whatever. Now I'm going to the gym. I need this one to just be like, mind body connection, as well as hard work, as well as like grind, and like whatever situation you're in, you're able to shape your conscious to best fit that situation, so that way you can derive the most from any given situation and perform the best. I think at least that's my goal of the observer, and I think that's kind of like being the ultimate I don't know what the right word is, like
the ultimate self.
No.
Being?
The ultimate, like, social expert, master? I don't know. Like, and also, or I guess the complex master, the master of the self, in a way. Like, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but, because it's not exactly that, but, I view it as basically a valuable skill to have.
That's interesting. And for me, this observer perspective doesn't allow you to do that. The observer perspective is like no shape, or it's a shape, but it doesn't have any holes that it has to fit through its
Oh,
existence.
it doesn't. But I'm saying it shapes the conscious to be able to fit through whatever holes the conscious mind has to fit through, because nothing else will shape. You were saying the conscious shapes the unconscious, right? So in that light, I'm saying the observer, or in that same way, like the observer shapes the unconscious. Nothing is shaping the observer, but the observer is shaping the conscious mind for whatever hole it needs to fill, reshaping it, I guess.
From my experience of it, I didn't feel as though my like observer perspective was able to interact with my conscious self.
Yeah. That's why I feel like our observers are like, my desired observer is different.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but that is interesting.
Should we wrap it up?
Yeah.
Cool.
So that way you don't have to do too much editing, and like, yeah, we want to make that episodes no longer like 2.5 hours, because it just takes too long to edit.
True.
And that way also we can get more content out on a more frequent basis.
For sure.
Oh, and almost forgot the quote to end the podcast. So this one is by Erasmus, and it's the summit of happiness is reached when a person is ready to be what he is. Kind of going with existentialism topic, or our discussion today a little bit. This was episode 4
of the Skeptic Minds podcast
with Brock Epperson
and Colin Winters. This is it.
Yeah, thanks for listening.